My son is 40 now. When I went to prison, he was only 2 years old, and all I left him was my name and a photograph tucked inside an envelope. His mother said it would be better that way, that a child needs silence, not shame. 35 years later, I walked out a free man and realized he was now older than I had been when I lost everything. I tried to reach out, but all I heard was, "You are not my father." If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Thomas Reeves. I was 70 years old the morning I stepped through the iron gate of FCI Elkton in Ohio after serving 35 years and 8 months. I had turned 25 the week before my sentencing. They called it a tragedy of wasted youth in the newspapers back then. Now, all that was left of that youth was a sunken face, a spine that curved slightly to the left, and hands that shook not from age, but from time. The guards didn't say much. One nodded to me like I was any other piece of paper being processed out. The other handed me a plastic bag with the items I'd come in with: a leather belt, a silver Timex wristwatch with a cracked face, and a driver's license that had expired 2 presidents ago. The belt no longer fit around my softened waist. The watch still ticked, somehow, and I strapped it on with fingers that had forgotten their dexterity. I looked down at the watch, at the faded black numbers and scratched crystal, and realized it had become more of a relic than a timekeeper. The seconds passed slowly, dragging across my skin like rusted chains. The license photo showed a clean-shaven man with thick black hair and cocky eyes. I barely remembered him. He was someone else entirely. I folded the license in half and slipped it into my shirt pocket. It didn't feel like mine anymore. Outside the prison gate, the asphalt shimmered under a mid-August sun. The air was thick and sweet with roadside grass and engine oil. I stood still for a while, feeling the wind on my face. It was one of the first times in decades that I could feel it without wire mesh or concrete around me. The wind wasn't strong, but it was sharp, cutting into the collar of my state-issued shirt. I didn't have a coat. No one brought me one. I didn't expect them to. A shuttle waited for those released. One of those gray county vans with stickers peeling off the doors and seats cracked from years of sun. I didn't board it. I had no destination to give, no one waiting on the other end. Instead, I walked down the service road. The gravel crunched beneath my old sneakers, and the sound reminded me of the exercise yard. I moved slowly. My right knee ached from an injury I'd gotten lifting boxes in the prison laundry 10 years ago. I had never reported it. The swelling came and went like a tide. There was a gas station about half a mile down. I remembered it from the times I'd seen it on transport, but now it looked different. It had grown slick and modern. There were LED signs, coffee pods in bright packaging, and self-checkout kiosks. I stood at the entrance for a while, breathing in the unfamiliar smells: plastic, burnt espresso, synthetic lemon from the mop water. I bought a bottle of water and an apple. The cashier didn't look up. I was just another man in a baggy shirt and state shoes, slipping through the cracks. I sat outside on the concrete curb and took a bite. The apple was sweeter than I expected, but the skin was too thick, the kind that sticks in your teeth. I chewed slowly, watching the trucks roll by on the highway. Their motion felt surreal, too fast for the pace of thought. I counted the seconds between each one, tapping them out on the plastic bottle with the edge of my fingernail, just like I used to count days with a pencil on the inside of my locker. Freedom didn't feel like a movie. It didn't come with a soundtrack or a slow-motion hug. It came with noise and heat, and a feeling like I was watching life happen through a glass window I couldn't touch. I didn't cry. I'd used up all my tears in the first 10 years. After that, you become someone who carries his grief like a coin in his pocket, always there, but never shown. I had $112 in gate money, a voucher for a bus ride, and a list of halfway houses that no longer accepted men over 65. I held the papers in my hand, the ink smudged from sweat. My name was printed on them in bold letters, Thomas Reeves. I said it aloud to myself once just to hear it in open air. It sounded hollow. I walked toward the bus station. It was 2 miles, but I didn't mind the walk. Every step felt both free and strange, as if the pavement might collapse underneath me at any moment. I passed a used car dealership with bright flags flapping in the wind. They reminded me of the county fair, where I'd once won a pocket knife throwing rings at milk bottles. That was before everything. A young man passed by on a bicycle, earbuds in, nodding to music I couldn't hear. He didn't see me. No one did. I was part of the landscape now, like the rusted fire hydrant or the cracked sidewalk. At the bus station, I sat on a metal bench and waited. The schedule posted behind the scratched glass made no sense to me. Routes had changed. Cities had merged. Time had moved in directions I hadn't followed. My watch showed 2:17 p.m. I wound it anyway, though I didn't know why. It was a ritual, one of the few I had left. I thought of my hands, how steady they used to be. I was a machinist before prison. My father taught me to work with lathes and drill presses in our garage back in Dayton. I remembered the smell of hot steel, the rhythm of polishing with fine oilcloths, the satisfaction of precision. I hadn't touched a tool in decades. I wondered if I still could, if my muscles would remember what my life had forgotten. I pulled the watch close to my face and tried to clean the crystal with my sleeve. It didn't help much. The scratches were permanent. I stared at my reflection in that tiny curved surface, distorted, fragmented, older than I could ever accept. The bus pulled in, wheezing, coughing gray smoke. I stood, clutching my bag, and stepped on. The driver didn't ask questions. I sat by the window and watched the prison disappear behind me in the distance, swallowed by trees and concrete and everything that had moved on. In my head, I tried to remember the face of my son. The last time I saw him, he was 2. He had soft curls and wide eyes. I had held him once in the courtroom before they took me away. I had never held him again. Now he would be older than I had been when I went in. That thought stayed with me, like a weight in my chest. Pressing deeper with every mile, the bus took me farther from the only place that had known me. I didn't know where I was going. But I knew one thing with certainty. The gate had opened, but something inside me had not. I began writing letters to my son during my 2nd year inside. The first year I could barely breathe, let alone write. The shock of confinement was too great, and my thoughts too tangled with fear, anger, and shame. But when the fog lifted, when I could sit still long enough to listen to the rhythm of the cell block rather than panic at every clank of metal, I found myself reaching for paper. It was thin, institutional stock, the kind that tore easily if your pen pressed too hard. The pens were dull and squeaked faintly on the page, leaving lines that looked like they had already faded before they dried. I didn't know how to start the first letter. I had missed his first steps, his first words, his first fever. I had no idea what his favorite food was, if he liked dogs, if he still cried at night. The only thing I had was a memory of the way he looked the last time I saw him. 2 years old, wrapped in a blue hoodie with a frog stitched on the chest. He had clung to his mother's leg in the hallway of the courthouse, unsure whether to come to me or stay where he was. I had knelt down, arms open, and for a moment he ran to me. For a moment, I was a father. So I began with that memory, that moment of brief connection, of skin against skin, his small arms around my neck. I wrote about it, not to him, but for him. I told him what it had meant, how I had held on to that second like a man holds onto a match in the dark. And then I signed it, simply, Your father, Thomas. At first, I mailed the letters to the last address I had for his mother, an apartment in Akron with rust-stained siding and a broken front step. I didn't know if she was still there. I didn't know if she'd ever read them, or if she'd burned them the moment they arrived. But I wrote anyway, every month, like clockwork. I kept track of time by my letters. I didn't count days or mark slashes on the wall. I counted envelopes. 42 envelopes meant 3.5 years. 60 meant 5. The letters became my calendar, my prayer, my habit. I never wrote much in them. No begging, no explanations, just small things. The kind of things fathers say when they're at home, reading the paper, sipping coffee. I'd tell him about the way the yard smelled after the rain, how the bread on Tuesdays was a little less stale than the rest of the week, how the radio in the laundry room sometimes picked up country music from Kentucky if the wind was right. I wanted him to know I was still here, that I still thought of him, that even inside this box, I was still trying to be his father in some way, even if all I could do was describe the sky. The prison gave us 2 stamps a month. If you wanted more, you had to barter. I once traded 3 packs of ramen and a bar of soap for a book of stamps from a guy who worked in the mailroom. That was the cost of a letter to your child: sodium, hygiene, and trust. Once a year, right before Christmas, I would receive a single envelope. The return address was always the same, just her name and a P.O. box, no location. Inside was a photograph, a new one each time. My son on a tricycle, my son holding a fishing pole, my son in a Halloween costume. Never a note, never a date, just an image, as if to say, he's alive, but not for you. I kept every photograph in a plastic bag, tucked inside my mattress lining where the guards wouldn't search. I knew it was against the rules to stash anything there, but I also knew the guards weren't going to punish an old man for hiding ghosts. When they changed our mattresses once every few years, I would carefully cut a slit in the new one and sew in the old memories with dental floss I'd saved up. The photographs had grown soft at the corners. One had a coffee stain. Another had a crease down the middle from being folded too often. But they were all I had. Sometimes I imagined what it would be like if he read my letters, if he knew I was writing. Would he be angry? Would he feel betrayed? Or would he feel nothing at all, because you can't miss someone who never showed up? I asked myself that every time I started a new letter, and every time I answered the same. It didn't matter. He didn't have to read them. He didn't even have to know they existed. I wrote them because I had to. Because not writing meant vanishing. It meant letting the concrete and steel and schedules consume me until I was nothing but a number. A slab of meat shuffled from cell to chow to yard and back again. The letters reminded me I had once been more than that. There was a routine to writing. I'd do it Sunday nights after lights out. I'd sit on the edge of my bunk, legs curled beneath me, the dim hallway bulb casting a rectangle of dusty light onto the floor. I'd write by touch more than sight. The paper would rest on the Bible I used as a writing board, not out of piety. I had lost most of my faith, but because it was the firmest surface I had. The smell of ink and the scratch of pen were comforting. It reminded me of my old workshop back when I was a machinist, back when precision mattered. These letters were my new machines, imperfect, handmade, fragile. But they ran on memory and hope, and that was enough. One day, a younger guy in the cell next to mine asked who I kept writing to. I told him the truth. He shook his head and said nothing. Later, he offered me a cigarette. I didn't smoke, but I took it. Sometimes silence was a form of solidarity. The older I got, the harder it became to write. My fingers stiffened. The words came slower. The pen felt heavier. But I forced myself. Even when arthritis made me clench my jaw in pain. Even when my eyes watered from trying to read my own crooked handwriting. I wrote. Because the act of writing was the only bridge I had left, even if no one was waiting on the other side. Years blurred. Inmates came and went. Cellmates changed. Units reshuffled. But the letters stayed constant. A quiet thread that ran through my time like a seam in old fabric. I became the man who wrote to a son he'd never see. Some laughed. Some pitied. Some avoided me altogether. But I kept going. One winter, the photo didn't come. Christmas passed. New Year's came. No envelope. I waited until March. Nothing. April. Still nothing. I imagined the worst. Maybe she had died. Maybe he had grown up and found the photos. Maybe he threw them away. Maybe he had children of his own now, and the thought of showing them his father's face made him sick. I never found out. But that year, I still wrote. I wrote as if nothing had changed, because for me, nothing had. The letters were all I had left of being a father. And in a place where time stops and identity erodes, even the illusion of connection was worth preserving. I kept writing, because I didn't want to disappear, because he was the only thing I had ever made that wasn't broken, because hope, even unspoken and unanswered, was still hope, and because once a father puts down the pen, the silence becomes permanent. Freedom didn't come to me with a shout or a song. It settled in like fog, low and stubborn, clinging to my skin. The first few days out, I wandered through town like a ghost in boots too loose around the ankles. My body was out, yes, but my mind still lived behind gates and buzzers. It moved along the edges of habits that had become so deeply etched in my bones, they no longer felt like choices. They felt like gravity. I woke up every morning at 5 a.m. sharp, without an alarm. The same way I had for 35 years. My eyes opened before the sun, staring at the brown ceiling of the motel room, and I waited for the guard's boots to echo down the corridor, waited for the metal door to crack open, for someone to shout, "Count." But no boots came, no count, just the hiss of the old heater and the soft wheeze of cars passing outside. I'd sit on the edge of the bed for a long time, my hands resting on my knees, head bowed slightly forward, not in prayer, in memory. That posture had been the only one I trusted, safe, centered, invisible. In prison, too much movement drew attention. Too much rest drew suspicion. You had to be somewhere in the middle, still but not lazy, alert but not nervous. The body remembers these lessons long after the door has opened. The carpet under my bare feet felt too soft. The beige walls, too blank. The motel had a faint smell of bleach and cigarettes, like the laundry room back in C Block. I caught myself sniffing the pillowcase the first night, half expecting the scent of state detergent. Instead, it was stale perfume and old air. I missed the concrete, not in the way a man misses home, but in the way a body misses a shape it's adapted to. Concrete was honest. It didn't pretend to be more than it was. It held heat in the summer, frost in the winter, and pain year-round. It never changed. That predictability was its comfort. You learned which parts were smooth, which were cracked. You knew which step echoed differently, which slab outside the mess hall had a seam that collected rain. I had memorized the floor of my cell the way others memorize the lines of a lover's face. Here, in this new place, the floors were uneven. The linoleum curled at the corners. The tiles in the bathroom were loose, and one clicked when I stepped on it. It unnerved me. Not because it was broken, but because I hadn't learned it yet. I hadn't lived enough days to map the rhythm of the floor. I had lived so long in a space where every movement had meaning, every hour a number, every gesture a signal. Now, the hours spilled. They stretched out across the day like spilled water, with no container to hold them. I would sit by the window for hours, watching birds peck at crumbs in the parking lot, trying to make sense of time that didn't ring a bell or shout a command. I still folded my socks military tight, still scrubbed the sink after brushing my teeth, still cut my nails on Saturdays and shaved every third morning. Not because I cared about appearance, but because routine was survival. In prison, routine was the only thing that gave a man back his name. Without it, you disappeared. I kept my watch on my wrist even when I slept. The same cracked Timex they returned to me in a Ziploc bag at discharge. I wound it every evening before bed, though it hadn't kept proper time in years. The tick was faint, a heartbeat beneath rust, but it reminded me I was still here, still moving forward, even if the numbers lied. I didn't know what to do with the quiet. It was too wide, too shapeless. I would walk to the diner down the street just to hear the sound of plates clinking and grease sizzling. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't need to. I just needed noise that wasn't threat, noise that didn't mean danger. In the penitentiary, silence was a blade, and noise was a shield. Here, silence was just absence. It scared me more than anything. At night, the hum of the refrigerator filled the motel room. I would lie still, tracing the ceiling cracks with my eyes, and imagine they were the hairline fractures in the concrete walls of my old cell. I counted them sometimes. 1, 2, 3, curve left. It helped me fall asleep, or at least pretend to. Sleep came like a thief, never regular, never peaceful. My dreams were mechanical and dull, full of static and chain link. I'd wake with my hands clenched, breath caught somewhere between fight and flight. The motel sheets twisted around my legs like bindings. I had to remind myself each time that there was no lock on the door. I tried watching television. The colors were too bright, the voices too fast. People laughed too much, too easily. They touched each other in ways that felt alien to me. I turned it off after a few minutes, each time feeling as though the world had kept spinning in my absence, and no one had bothered to leave breadcrumbs. I kept a notebook beside the bed, not for writing, but for counting. I made small marks in the corner of each page, one for every day spent out. The first page had 7 marks, then 12. Then I stopped counting. Not because it didn't matter, but because I didn't know what I was counting toward. Freedom wasn't a gate opening. It was a question with no answer, a field with no fences, no signs. I had spent my life walking lines, and now there were none. I often walked the perimeter of the motel parking lot, around and around, in even steps. 4 steps down the side, turn. 10 across the back, turn. Repeat. I did it every evening. My shoes scuffed a faint pattern into the gravel, and I followed it like a ritual. It gave me a sense of edges, and edges, I had learned, were safer than open ground. The motel clerk watched me from the window sometimes. A young guy, maybe 25. He probably thought I was crazy. Maybe I was, but I didn't care. He'd never heard keys jangle at 3 a.m. and known it meant someone was getting dragged out of their bunk. He'd never memorized the sound of a fight before it started, or the way blood smelled on concrete after a cold night. He didn't know that memory lives in the body, not just the mind. The body remembers. It remembers the cold slab under your spine, the clang of metal trays, the sting of disinfectant, the silence before lights out, the ache of 40 winters in your knees, the caution in your gaze, the stoop in your walk, not from age, but from vigilance. Freedom was just another kind of adjustment, a new box, bigger, but still unfamiliar, and the concrete, rough, gray, simple, had been the only place where I ever truly knew how to stand. It took me 3 separate visits to the public library before I gathered the nerve to sit down in front of one of the computers. The first time, I just walked through the doors and stood in the lobby, staring at the rows of books and glowing monitors. The second time, I got as far as the computer station, but pretended I was only looking for the newspaper rack. The third time, I asked the lady at the front desk for help. She pointed to an empty computer and handed me a guest login slip. The paper was warm from her hand. I carried it like a permit, as if someone might stop me before I sat down. The keyboard looked strange, too clean, too flat. The keys were silent when I pressed them, which made me uneasy. I liked the clack of real typewriters. That sound had weight. This felt like tapping on air. I logged in with shaking fingers. My hands had always been steady in the past, especially back in the shop. I used to carve steel with a tolerance of 0.5 millimeter. Now I could barely hold the mouse straight. The browser opened to a search page. Just a blinking cursor and a white field, waiting. I typed in his name. It wasn't a rare name, but not common either. I had whispered it to myself every night for decades like a prayer, just to remember it, just to keep it alive. Seeing it appear on the screen, typed in my own hands, felt like setting a bird loose after years of keeping it caged in the dark. I hesitated before hitting enter. I stared at the name, my heart knocking against my ribs like it wanted to break through. Then I pressed the key. Dozens of results appeared. Newsletters, business profiles, social media pages. I didn't know which one belonged to him. I clicked slowly, opening tabs one by one like drawers in an unfamiliar house. Most led nowhere. A few had photos. And then I saw him. The face was older than the one I remembered from the photographs I used to get. Broader shoulders, more lines around the mouth, eyes deeper set. But it was him. There was no mistaking it. His smile was crooked in the same way mine used to be. His brow furrowed even when he laughed. He wore a blue checkered shirt and stood in front of a barbecue grill, one hand holding a metal spatula, the other resting on the shoulder of a boy. His son, I assumed. My grandson. I leaned back in the chair, air catching in my throat. The image had been posted a few weeks ago. The caption read, "Family cookout. Finally, some sunshine." He looked happy. He looked whole. He looked like someone who didn't need a shadow from the past coming to darken the doorway. I scrolled further. A picture of a woman, his wife, I guessed, smiling next to him, holding a glass of wine. Another of them at a school play, their daughter on stage wearing a cardboard crown. It was a life, full and intact. One I had no part in. One I could only peer into from the outside, like a man watching a warm house from behind a frozen window. I didn't know what to feel. Joy, maybe, that he had turned out all right. Or grief that I hadn't been there to see it happen. Mostly I felt small, like someone who had been erased, but still lingered faintly, like a fingerprint on glass. I opened the Contact tab on his website. There was an email address there. It was a simple address. His name, followed by a company domain. He ran his own business, consulting of some sort. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but the website was polished and modern, filled with client reviews and mission statements. I clicked on the email link, and the screen opened a blank message. It was just a box, white, silent, waiting. I stared at it for a long time. Then I began to type. I didn't say much, just that I had found him, that I knew he had no obligation to answer, that I understood the years couldn't be rewound, and that he didn't owe me anything. I wrote that I was alive, and that I had carried his name with me all this time. I told him I had nothing to give but the truth, and that I would accept whatever silence came next. I read it over 3 times. Each time it felt smaller, but it was honest. I clicked send. The screen flickered for a moment, then returned to neutral, as if nothing had happened, as if I had dropped a stone into an ocean and the surface had already smoothed over. I sat there for another half hour, not doing anything, just watching the inbox. I refreshed it every 5 minutes. Nothing came. Of course it didn't. It had only been 30 minutes. But I waited anyway, because waiting was something I understood. Back in my motel room, I opened the window and let in the cool evening air. I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the little table with my watch in front of me. The hands ticked softly, stubborn in their imperfection. I turned it over in my palm, remembering the last time I had held my son. He had been barely 2. He had cried when the officer pulled me away, though I doubt he remembered that now. Maybe he didn't remember me at all. The motel smelled of damp carpet and lemon cleaner. The heater clicked on and off in uneven intervals. I sat in silence for hours. At dawn, I checked the inbox again. There was one reply. It was short. 5 words. "You are not my father." That was all. No greeting. No name. No signature. Just those 5 words. Plain as a cold wind. I read it again. Then again. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't heave. I didn't cry. It was as if I had already rehearsed this moment so many times that the real thing came as no surprise. It was confirmation, not shock. I closed the browser. The screen went dark. In the black reflection, I saw my face. Not the one he remembered, if he remembered me at all. A stranger's face. Older, grayer, hollowed out by years of walls and rules and repetition. My image flickered and disappeared as the screen dimmed to sleep. I gathered my things and left the library. The morning sun had begun to warm the sidewalks, and the scent of fresh-cut grass drifted in from a lawn across the street. A boy on a bike sped past me, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. He didn't look at me. No one did. I was just a man walking alone. And somewhere out there was a life with my name buried beneath it. A name I had once given. A name I no longer owned. The room was still. Not the kind of stillness that came with sleep or calm, but the heavy, weighted kind that settles after a collapse, like the way dust hangs in the air after something has broken. I sat at the small table by the window, the one with the scratched faux wood surface and the single metal leg that wobbled when I shifted my weight. The motel curtains were drawn, but thin slivers of early morning light pushed through the gaps like quiet accusations, slicing the room into pale, uneven strips. The email replayed in my mind over and over. 5 words. "You are not my father." They had no punctuation, no softness, no pause, just a flat refusal. A final note in a song that never really began. I didn't touch the coffee the motel had left by the microwave. The packet sat unopened next to the styrofoam cup, its foil wrapper catching the light with every breeze that stirred the curtain. I stared at it longer than I should have, the way a prisoner might stare at a key he's not allowed to use. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't thirsty. I wasn't anything. Just still. Just listening to the silence. The silence in that room was different from the silence in prison. In prison, silence was always filled with things. Creaks of bunks, coughs in the night, muffled voices from distant cells. It was alive, always shifting, always aware of itself. But here outside, the silence was sterile. It had no shape, no pulse. It was like floating in a sealed box, where even your own breath sounded like an intrusion. I leaned back in the chair, my hands resting on the arms, my fingers curled inwards like dried leaves. I had kept them folded since the night before, afraid that if I opened them, I might start shaking again. I had always prided myself on having steady hands. As a machinist, precision was everything. Back then, a twitch could ruin a thread, damage a gear, destroy a whole build. My father used to say, "A man's worth is in the calmness of his hand." He didn't live long enough to see my hands wrapped in cuffs. I turned to the window and looked at the shadow of the blinds across the floor. It reminded me of cell bars. Strange how the world outside still found ways to mimic the one I had left behind. The longer I stared at those lines, the more the floor resembled concrete. The room's carpet was threadbare and stained in places, but in my mind, it hardened. I could almost hear the echo of boots on it, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. My wristwatch ticked faintly beside the half-empty glass of water on the nightstand. The sound was slow and irregular, like an old man's breathing. I picked it up and held it close to my ear, letting its rhythm ground me. It had survived everything. Years in a drawer, heat, cold, even rust. It kept going, even if it no longer told the right time. Maybe that was its value. Maybe that was mine too. I hadn't turned on the television. The remote sat untouched on the arm of the faded chair across the room. I couldn't bear the noise. I couldn't stand the idea of forced laughter, of cheerful music underscoring bright voices pretending everything made sense. In that room, I didn't want to hear anything that tried to distract me from the truth. I needed to sit in it, to let it settle over me fully. Beside the lamp was a small notebook I had started keeping. Just lists, mostly. Things I remembered. Songs I used to hum. Names of streets from childhood. The smell of motor oil on my overalls. The creak of the back porch swing. I hadn't added anything new since the message came. I opened it to the last page and stared at the words I'd written the day before. Maybe he will write back. I traced the sentence with my finger, then closed the notebook and slipped it under the pillow like a child hiding a bad grade from his parents. The room's heater kicked on. It filled the air with a dry, dusty smell. It reminded me of the vents in the old machine shop where I worked as a teenager, back when my hands were quick and my life still had gears to turn. I had once dreamed of owning my own place, a real workshop with my name on the door. Reeves Precision. I'd drawn a logo for it once in the back of a math book. I could still picture it. Stamped metal letters curved over a gear. A boy's dream. A dream that got buried under years of concrete and wire. I stood and walked slowly to the small mirror above the dresser. The face that looked back at me was older than I remembered. Deep lines cut into the skin around my mouth. My eyes had sunk back into their sockets, dark and tired. I looked like someone who had missed something important, like someone who had arrived after everything worth seeing had already been taken down. I turned on the faucet and let the water run until it warmed. The sink was stained around the drain, and the chrome on the faucet had peeled, exposing the dull metal underneath. I splashed water on my face and dried it with a towel that smelled faintly of detergent and cigarette ash. I stood there for a while, gripping the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. I didn't recognize the man in the mirror. I wasn't sure I wanted to. Back at the table, I sat again and watched the light shift on the wall. The day was moving, whether I moved with it or not. Outside, I heard a car start, a door slam, the distant bark of a dog. Life was continuing. That was the cruelest part. The world didn't pause for rejection. It just kept going, dragging you along even if your feet refused to move. I picked up the envelope I had brought from prison, the one that had carried my final letter. I had saved it, maybe out of habit, maybe out of ritual. The address was printed neatly, my own hand betraying the tremble in my fingers. I rubbed my thumb over the paper, feeling the texture. Paper was the last thing that ever connected me to him, the last thing I had control over. I considered writing again, just to say I understood, but I didn't. Not really. I didn't understand how a life could go on without room for forgiveness. Still, I didn't blame him. He didn't owe me anything. That was the truth. And the truth, I had learned, doesn't always come with warmth. Sometimes it sits across from you in a quiet room and stares you down until you look away. I laid the envelope flat on the table and smoothed out its corners. Then I folded it once, twice, and slipped it into the notebook, pressing it between 2 pages like a leaf from a tree I no longer had the right to stand under. The day passed slowly. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the quiet, with my watch ticking, my past sitting across from me like an uninvited guest. And for the first time since I walked out of prison, I realized I was not waiting anymore. The silence wasn't something to break. It was all that was left. I found his address the week after the message arrived. It hadn't been hard. His company website had a physical location listed at the bottom in small gray letters, one of those suburban zip codes that told you everything about the neighborhood before you even saw it. I copied it down into my notebook, the same page where I kept the list of cities I'd dreamed of visiting once. I never visited any of them. The list was just something I wrote on cold nights in the cell to convince myself there was still a future. The bus took 2 hours and 17 minutes. I knew that because I timed it on my watch, the one that still ticked unevenly, like a stubborn heart. I sat near the back, where the windows were streaked with dried rain and dust, and watched the city shift into suburbs, gas stations giving way to tree-lined streets, the skyline disappearing into rows of identical houses with trimmed hedges and plastic flamingos. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe I wanted to see the life he had built, just to prove to myself that it existed. Maybe I thought seeing it would help me let go. Or maybe deep down, I wanted to see something broken, some small crack that would let me believe I could still be useful to him, that he needed fixing, and I still had tools left in my hands. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where the garbage bins were all rolled out on the same day, where the lawns were trimmed at the same height, and the cars matched the color of the driveways. The street signs were clean, the pavement freshly patched. Everything looked like it had been pressed from a mold and set into place before anyone lived there. I got off at the corner and walked the rest of the way. His house was near the end of a cul-de-sac, painted a soft yellow with white shutters and a blue mailbox that leaned just slightly forward. There were balloons tied to the porch railings, red and green and silver, and a hand-lettered sign above the garage that read, "Happy Birthday, Tyler." The letters were crooked, but cheerful. Someone had drawn a big smiley face next to them, and the marker had bled through the paper in places. Music floated out from the backyard, something light and bouncy, with clapping and laughter layered underneath. I stood across the street beneath the shade of a tree that had dropped most of its leaves. They crunched under my shoes as I shifted my weight, hands deep in the pockets of my worn coat. I didn't move any closer. I didn't need to. Through the side yard, I saw glimpses of the celebration. A grill smoked in the corner, and a man, him older now, more solid, stood beside it, flipping burgers with one hand while balancing a toddler on his hip. The child had cake smeared on his chin and wore a paper crown that kept slipping sideways. Nearby, a woman handed out cups of lemonade. Children ran in circles, some carrying balloons, others holding plastic swords. Folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and adults sat chatting, laughing, holding plates on their knees. It was everything I had pictured during all those nights in my cell. Except I wasn't in it. I wasn't even close. I was just a man on the curb, watching a celebration I had no part in. A celebration that didn't know it had a ghost for a witness. I stayed there for nearly an hour. I watched him laugh, my son, and I tried to match it with the face in my memories, but they didn't fit. The boy I'd held once was gone, and this man didn't need anything from me. He looked like he belonged exactly where he was, surrounded by people who knew the stories behind his smile, who had seen the late nights, the scraped knees, the first steps of his own children. People who hadn't missed decades, people who hadn't disappeared. The smell of grilled meat drifted across the street, carried on a soft breeze. It hit me unexpectedly, sweet, familiar, filled with charcoal and something sugary. It reminded me of cookouts from before, the kind with corn on the cob and cheap paper plates and transistor radios playing baseball games. I hadn't tasted barbecue since the late 80s. In prison, meat came in gray chunks, uniform and tasteless. Here, the air itself was seasoned with memory. I turned away when they began to sing. The chorus of happy birthday voices, the clapping, the laughter that followed. It all hit too close. I couldn't bear to hear him speak. I couldn't risk hearing his voice and finding nothing familiar in it. That would have been too much. That would have broken something I wasn't sure I could rebuild. I walked down the block, my steps slower than before. The street was lined with parked cars, minivans and SUVs, most of them clean, one or two with bumper stickers about honor students or sports teams. I counted them as I walked, a habit from years of counting things just to stay sane. 16 cars, 1 stray cat, 3 trash bins still full. I sat at the bus stop for 20 minutes before the bus arrived. I didn't take my eyes off the sidewalk. A woman stood nearby with a stroller. The baby inside giggled at something I couldn't see. I tried to smile, but couldn't manage it. My mouth wouldn't lift. It was as if all the muscles had forgotten how. Back at the motel, I peeled off my coat and hung it on the back of the chair. It still smelled faintly of fall leaves and charcoal. I didn't wash it. I wanted to hold on to that smell a little longer. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the carpet, tracing the faded pattern with my shoe. It was a repeating motif of blue diamonds and brown squares, worn thin in the center. I had memorized it without realizing. The room felt smaller than before, not in size, but in feeling. It closed in around me, not menacing, just tired. The silence returned, but this time it carried a different weight. It wasn't hollow. It was full of everything I'd seen, everything I wasn't. I opened my notebook and turned to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, October 9th, Tyler's birthday party. I didn't add anything else, just the date and the words, a simple record, proof that I had seen it, that I had witnessed something good, even if it wasn't mine. The light outside faded slowly. The sunset leaked through the window blinds, turning the room amber for a few brief moments before retreating completely. I didn't turn on the lamp. I just sat there in the half-darkness, my watch ticking quietly on the nightstand, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The party had ended. The cake had been cut. The balloons would deflate. The sign would be taken down. But in my memory, it would remain. A celebration I had no right to attend. A joy that wasn't mine. And yet I had stood there, and I had watched it. I found the job through a flyer taped to the window of a laundromat. It was printed in black and white, the edges curled, the ink slightly faded from the sun. Warehouse help wanted. Full-time, night shift. No experience necessary. There was a phone number at the bottom, with tear-off tabs, most of them still hanging untouched. I took one, folded it into the front page of my notebook, and carried it in my pocket for 3 days before I made the call. They didn't ask much, just if I could lift over 40 pounds, if I had steel-toe boots, and if I could start Monday. I answered yes to all 3, though only the last was true. I borrowed the boots from a church donation box on a street downtown. They were a size too big and rubbed my heels raw for the first week, but they did the job. The warehouse was on the edge of the industrial district, tucked behind a row of chain-link fences and loading docks, stained with years of oil and brake dust. It smelled like rubber and cardboard and rain-soaked cement. There were no signs, just a small metal plaque beside a dented door with the company's name. All Span Distribution. I arrived half an hour early on my first day, as I always used to, and waited by the side entrance, sipping burnt coffee from a gas station cup and watching the sky shift from slate gray to bruised purple. Inside, the air was cold and dry. Fluorescent lights buzzed above us in long rows, humming just loud enough to irritate without drawing attention. Everything echoed. Every step, every beep of the barcode scanner, every dropped pallet. The sound bounced around the steel rafters and came back distorted, like voices underwater. They gave me a name tag, Tom, printed in block letters on a sticker that barely clung to my shirt. The glue wore off before the end of my shift. I didn't ask for another. My job was simple. Scan, lift, stack, repeat. Boxes came in on rollers, some light, some heavy. I'd scan the code, sort them by aisle, push them on a dolly, and shelve them in the right bin. If I was fast, I could get through 300 in a night. If I was tired, maybe half that. No one cared, so long as I kept moving. The warehouse ran like a machine. The rhythm was mechanical, steady. That suited me fine. I didn't have to talk much, just nods and grunts to the other workers, mostly younger men, some barely in their 20s. They wore earbuds, played music I couldn't name, moved with a looseness I didn't recognize. One of them had a tattoo that ran down his neck like a vine. Another wore gloves with the fingers cut off. They never asked where I was from. I never asked them anything back. I found comfort in the repetition. I liked the feel of the barcode scanner in my hand, the soft click it made when I pulled the trigger. I liked the heft of the boxes, the way my muscles burned after a long shift. Pain, I'd learned, was a form of grounding. It reminded you that you were still here. I kept my watch on my wrist the entire time. I checked it every break, not because I was waiting for the shift to end, but because I liked knowing the time. The real time. Not the bells and calls and lockdowns of prison, but the kind of time people outside measured their days by. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2:30. I traced each hour with a sort of reverence, like lighting candles in a chapel. My locker was near the back exit, number 307. I wrote the number in my notebook, not because I would forget it, but because the act of writing made it mine. I kept a spare shirt in there, a half-eaten protein bar, and a folded photo from a magazine, a mountain range covered in snow. I never liked the beach. I needed cold, stillness, weight. On break, I sat on a plastic crate near the vending machines. I didn't smoke, but I liked being near the smokers. Their movements felt familiar, the way they leaned against the wall, silent, watching the dark beyond the loading bay doors. The orange glow of their cigarettes reminded me of the lights we used to see in the prison yard, distant, fleeting, human. I never joined their conversations. I didn't have stories to share. They talked about girlfriends, rent, car repairs. I had none of those things. Just the job. Just the rhythm. That was enough. I started keeping a tally in my notebook, not of boxes moved or hours worked, but of how many days I made it through without thinking of the message. The one that ended with, "You are not my father." The number rose slowly. 2 days, then 5, then 9. But it always reset. One word, one scent, one sound, and it all came back. Still, the tally helped. It gave shape to the space between wounds. The warehouse had a clock above the supervisor's office. It ticked loudly, louder than any clock had the right to. I watched it during the last hour of every shift. It reminded me of the wall clock from the visitation room back in prison. Big, round, always running 5 minutes fast. I used to stare at that clock between visits, waiting for my name to be called. Now I stared at this one, not waiting for anything, just counting. When the shift ended, I didn't talk to anyone. I changed shirts, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked the 2 miles back to the motel. I passed the same diner, the same tire shop, the same alley with broken glass that caught the moonlight like teeth. I walked with my head down, my boots thudding in a pattern I had memorized. Back in the room, I peeled off my boots and placed them by the heater. My feet were blistered and damp, my heels raw. I filled the sink with warm water, added a cap of rubbing alcohol, and soaked a towel before pressing it to my ankles. It stung. I welcomed it. I sat on the bed with the notebook in my lap and drew a small line on the margin. One more day, one more shift, one more rhythm. It was enough. The room smelled like sweat and soap and dust. The carpet felt like sandpaper against my socks. The heater clicked again and again, trying to stay alive. And so did I. In that warehouse, among boxes and numbers and hums, I had found something close to peace. Not joy, Not healing, but motion, direction, the sense that I was still part of a system, even if it didn't care who I was. Sometimes that was all a man could ask for. A place to move, a place to carry weight, a place to keep going. It was folded into quarters, tucked deep in the lining of my canvas duffel bag, just beneath the spare shirt and the copy of Lonesome Dove I had found on a free table at the bus depot. I hadn't looked at it since my release. I'd carried it like a relic, hidden, untouched, too fragile to unfold, too heavy to discard. That afternoon, after my shift at the warehouse, I finally laid it on the table in the motel room and stared at the faded crease running across the middle like a scar. The photograph was old, paper-thin, soft at the edges, yellowing like dried leaves. The corners curled, and there were faint watermarks in the bottom left, a sign of some long-forgotten spill. I traced the fold line with my thumb before opening it fully, careful not to tear it. The image came into view slowly, like something being developed in a dark room. My eyes adjusted to its quiet. It was a black-and-white snapshot, grainy, taken with one of those disposable cameras from the drugstore. It showed a small boy, my son, maybe 2 years old, perched on the edge of a sandbox, gripping a plastic shovel in one hand, his mouth slightly open as if mid-laugh or mid-question. His cheeks were full, his eyes bright, and his little shoes were mismatched. One Velcro strap dangled, the other neatly fastened. He wore a striped t-shirt with a faded cartoon dinosaur across the chest. I had looked at this photograph 1,000 times during my sentence. I had memorized every shadow, every texture, the way the sunlight hit the edge of his hair. It was the only image of him I had held on to, the only proof that I had once been a father, even if only briefly. It had survived transfers between facilities, shakedowns, and years pressed between the pages of legal documents and rejection letters. When the corners began to fray, I reinforced them with transparent tape, cut precisely with the edge of a plastic ID card. Back then, I used to keep it tucked inside the cover of a Bible I didn't read. The guards never searched that far. I told myself it was safer there, under the Psalms and warnings. It became part of my ritual. Every Sunday morning, I would take it out, study it in silence, and return it to its place with the kind of reverence some men gave to icons. Looking at it now, in the weak afternoon light filtering through the dusty motel blinds, felt different. The photograph hadn't changed, but I had. His face hadn't aged, but mine had. The boy was frozen in time, forever too, while I sat across from him with 70 years carved into my skin. I pressed the photo flat on the table and leaned forward. I imagined what he might have sounded like back then. High-pitched, quick, the way toddlers ask 1,000 questions in one breath. I wondered if he liked peanut butter sandwiches, if he had cried when he scraped his knees, if he had been afraid of thunder. These were questions I would never answer. The photo didn't hold those sounds. It didn't carry his voice. It only offered the surface. It told me everything and nothing at once. I noticed for the first time that there was something scribbled faintly in pencil on the back. A date, July 9th, 1987, and below it, a single word. Park. The handwriting wasn't mine. Probably hers. His mother. She must have mailed it to me in one of those rare envelopes that made it past the screening room and the indifference of prison mail rooms. I tried to remember the envelope it had arrived in, what else had been inside, but the memory was too blurred. Only the photograph had survived the attrition of years. I turned it back over and looked at it again, this time not as a father, but as a man studying a stranger's family photo left behind at a bus stop. That's what I had become, a stranger to the boy in the picture, a witness to something I no longer belonged to. The table creaked as I leaned on it. My elbow brushed the ashtray I never used, sending it spinning slightly before it came to rest. The sound echoed through the room like a pin dropped into a well. I picked up the photograph and walked to the mirror above the sink. I held it beside my face. The contrast was cruel. His soft, new life beside my weathered one. I could still see a faint resemblance. The nose, the shape of the brow. But my eyes were not the same. They had sunk deeper, narrowed with time and dust, and too many doors slammed shut. I set the photo on the sink and ran the tap, splashing cold water on my face. I didn't dry it right away. I let it drip, watching the droplets fall onto the edge of the sink, thinking of the years I'd spent counting drips in the middle of the night, just to stay sane. The rhythm of water was the only sound that couldn't be taken from you. Back at the table, I pulled my notebook from the drawer. I opened to a blank page and wrote, "He was 2. I was 25. That day, he played in the sand, and I watched from the edge of the world. The ink skipped slightly over the grain of the paper, and I pressed harder with the pen. I didn't know what to do with the photograph now. It felt wrong to keep it hidden again, but it also didn't belong anywhere visible. I didn't have a frame. I didn't have a wall. I didn't have anyone to show it to. So I folded it, carefully, back into quarters and slid it into the back of the notebook. Not between pages, but inside the cover, tight and secret, the way it had always been. That night, I placed the notebook beside my pillow. I left the motel window cracked, letting the cool air settle over me like a blanket. The streetlight flickered outside, casting long shadows that reached across the carpet toward the bed. I lay still, listening to the silence and the distant sound of tires on wet pavement. The photograph rested inches from my head. It didn't bring comfort, not anymore, but it anchored me. It reminded me that something had existed once, that I had been more than this. In the dark, I turned my watch toward me and read the time. 2:16 a.m. The exact time meant nothing, but I logged it anyway in my mind as the hour I remembered the weight of paper, the shape of a face, the permanence of absence, and the ache of holding on to something you're not allowed to keep. I found the church by accident. It sat quietly between a hardware store and a dry cleaner on the far end of a street I rarely walked. No steeple, no bells, just a flat roof, a faded wooden sign, and a cracked concrete walkway that led to a set of brown double doors. The words painted on the glass read, "St. Jude's, open daily, all welcome." The paint had begun to peel, each letter curling at the edges like burnt paper. I didn't go in that day. I walked past it 3 times before I finally pushed the door open the following week, early in the morning when the street was still quiet, and the air carried the scent of cold metal and last night's rain. The hinges let out a soft groan as the door opened, and I paused at the threshold, half expecting someone to look up, to ask why I was there. No one did. The sanctuary was dim, not dark, just softened by the colored light that poured through 2 narrow stained glass windows on either side. Dust floated in slow spirals through the beams of red and blue. The carpet was worn thin in places, especially near the altar. Rows of wooden pews lined the room in neat symmetry, each one marked with scratches and polished by the weight of decades of elbows and hands. The air smelled of old wood, beeswax, and something faintly floral. Lilies, maybe, or funeral arrangements left too long. I walked slowly down the center aisle and sat near the back, second row from the exit. I didn't remove my coat. I didn't bow my head or cross myself. I just sat, hands folded in my lap, back straight, feet planted firmly on the floor. It was the same posture I used during sentencing, the posture of someone waiting to be called forward, but knowing he won't be. The silence was different here. Not the emptiness of the motel room, not the humming pressure of the warehouse. This was a full silence. It had weight, like a hand on the shoulder. I could feel it settle into my bones, working its way into the space behind my ribs where tension lived. There were no voices, no music, no service. Just the occasional creak of the roof adjusting, or the muffled hum of a car passing outside. I found comfort in that. Nothing demanded anything from me. No one asked for explanation or offered advice. I could simply exist, even if just for an hour, inside something still and ancient. In prison, I had gone to chapel twice. Not for faith, not even for the break in routine, just for the quiet. But even there, silence had been crowded with eyes, with rumors, with the shifting weight of men who no longer believed in anything, least of all, in forgiveness. Here, the silence felt older. It didn't care what I had done. It didn't ask whether I was sorry. It just held me. I looked up at the stained glass window above the pulpit. The design was simple: a shepherd standing beneath a tree, one hand raised toward a flock, the other clutching a staff. His face was obscured by cracks in the glass. Only his gesture remained, open, unsure if it was beckoning or warning. I tried to remember the last time I had prayed. Maybe when the verdict came. Maybe when they told me I wouldn't be eligible for parole until my 60th birthday. Maybe when my name was removed from a school record, from a family photo, from the world outside the wire. But the truth was, I hadn't prayed in years. Not out loud. I'd spoken to silence plenty, whispered to the dark, bargained with my own reflection. But those weren't prayers. They were something else, desperate echoes sent into the void. I sat there for a long time. My watch ticked steadily on my wrist. I didn't check the time. I just listened to it, letting the sound anchor me. That familiar, imperfect rhythm. The second hand jumped with each pulse, and I followed it like a heartbeat that had learned how to keep going on its own. Eventually, an older man entered through the side door. He wore a dark sweater, his hair white and thin. He didn't look at me, just walked slowly to the front pew, knelt with care, and stayed there for a while, head bowed low. I watched him, not out of curiosity, but out of wonder. Wonder at how some people still knew how to kneel, still remembered the shape of humility. When he rose and left, the space he had occupied remained somehow different, warmer, touched. I didn't kneel. I wasn't sure I knew how anymore. But I did close my eyes. And in that dark, I thought about the boy in the photograph. I pictured his face, not as a child, but as the man he had become. I tried to imagine his voice, the sound of him reading to his own children, the way he might have said my name if he had ever been given the chance. And in that moment, I spoke, not with words, but with feeling, with weight. I asked, not for forgiveness, not even for peace, but for presence. I asked to be seen, not by God or heaven or saints, but by myself. I needed to see me, all of me, the parts I had buried, the man who had walked free but still carried a cell inside him. When I opened my eyes, the light had shifted. The window glowed deeper now, richer, like stained fruit. Dust still danced through the air, indifferent and gentle. I stood slowly, joints cracking with the effort, and walked toward the exit. My boots echoed along the floor. I didn't turn back. Outside, the air was cooler. The city had moved on. Cars passed. People walked dogs. Someone laughed across the street. The world hadn't stopped for my visit. It never had. It never would. But something had shifted in me. Small, quiet, like the flutter of wings behind stone. I walked back to the motel without rush, without counting my steps. The watch ticked. The sky dimmed. And in my chest, the silence from the church remained, not empty, but full. Full of the things I would never say, the people I would never meet, and the life I had almost remembered how to feel. It started the same way all the letters used to start, with my name in the top left corner and the date just beneath it. I wrote it in block letters, slow and deliberate, like a man etching something into stone rather than putting ink to paper. I sat at the small table by the window in the motel room, the one with the wobble in the leg and the burn mark near the corner, probably from someone who had put out a cigarette too close to the wood. The sun had already slipped behind the horizon, leaving the room dim except for the lamp on the nightstand. The bulb flickered every so often, humming faintly like an insect trapped behind glass. I had taken a sheet of yellow legal paper from the pad I kept in the drawer next to my notebook. It had lines that were a little too wide, the kind that made your words look lonely on the page. I used a pen I'd borrowed from the warehouse break room, blue ink, half-dried from disuse. It scratched against the paper like it was resisting me. I didn't know what to say. The words I had carried in my chest for years didn't come out the way I expected them to. They felt too heavy, too soft, too hollow. I wrote and rewrote the first line 3 times before settling on something plain. I don't expect this letter to change anything. That was the truth. I didn't, but I needed to write it anyway. Not for him, for me. For the weight I'd been carrying every day since I walked out of that cell with the old photo pressed against my ribs. I told him who I was, not in name, but in memory. I wrote about the day he was born, not in detail. There's no dignity in trying to sound poetic about something I'd mostly missed, but in fragments. The way his mother looked as she slept in the hospital bed, the sound of his first cry, the paper bracelet they wrapped around his ankle with my last name printed in tiny letters. I wrote it all like a man remembering someone else's life, someone better, someone who didn't leave. The ink blotted near the edge of the page where my hand trembled. I waited for it to dry before continuing. I told him about prison, not the crimes, not the bars, not the violence, just the stillness, the counting, the years that layered over me like dust until I could barely see myself in the mirror. I told him about the photo, how I used to look at it every Sunday, how I taped the corners and memorized his face so I wouldn't forget the only proof I had that I mattered to someone once. Outside, a siren passed, distant but steady, cutting through the night like a thread pulled through fabric. I paused to listen, then returned to the letter. I didn't ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not time, not a second chance. I wrote that clearly. "You don't owe me anything," I said. Not a reply, not a thought. I just wanted you to know who I was before I disappear for good. I wrote about my job, the warehouse, the cold air, the broken dolly I repaired on my own time because it gave me something to do with my hands. I told him how I still woke up before dawn, out of habit more than need, and how I drank my coffee black now because it reminded me of the yard, of metal benches, of frost on cement. There was no poetry in the letter, no eloquence, just a man trying to put 35 years into 3 pages and knowing he'd fail. But I kept writing. Because I had to. Because silence, once it sets in, becomes impossible to break unless you force your voice through the crack. By the second page, my hand ached. I flexed my fingers, rubbed the knuckles, then picked the pen back up. I wrote about the church, about the way the light came through the stained glass and cast colored shadows on the pews. I told him I wasn't a religious man, but that I had sat there long enough to believe that maybe some silences weren't empty after all. I tried to end the letter 3 times, first with "I wish you well," then "take care," and finally with "I hope you find everything I never gave you." That one stayed. I signed it. Tom Reeves. Not Dad. Not father. Just a name. The only one I had any right to. I folded the pages neatly, pressing the creases flat with the side of my thumb. I slid them into an envelope and addressed it in the same block lettering. His name. His street. The house with the balloons and the barbecue grill and the people who laughed without me. I licked the flap and sealed it. Then I set it on the table and stared at it. I stared at it for an hour. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of my watch and the occasional thrum of pipes in the wall. I imagined the letter arriving. I imagined him opening it. I imagined every possible reaction, confusion, anger, indifference. And in none of those versions did he smile. In none of them did he soften. I took the envelope and walked it to the edge of the bed, then stood there, uncertain. Eventually, I placed it inside the drawer of the nightstand, behind the motel's copy of the New Testament. I closed the drawer slowly, not because I was hiding it, but because I knew I wasn't ready to send it. Not yet. Maybe not ever, but I had written it. That was something. That was more than I had done in a long time. I sat on the edge of the bed, turned off the lamp, and lay back, hands folded across my stomach like a man waiting for a verdict. And in the darkness, I could still feel the weight of that letter. Not in the drawer, but in me. It happened on a Wednesday, late morning, the kind of quiet, unremarkable day where the clouds hang low but never break into rain, and the wind seems too lazy to move anything heavier than a candy wrapper. I had walked further than usual, past the diner and the tire shop, into a part of town I hadn't explored since I got out. The sidewalks were wider here, the houses older, with porches that sagged gently under the weight of age. The air carried the scent of damp soil and exhaust, tinged with faint laundry detergent from somewhere upwind. I didn't have a destination. I rarely did. I walked to keep my legs from forgetting, to keep the blood moving, to feel something other than stillness inside my chest. The rhythm of footstep after footstep had become a kind of quiet medicine. No thoughts, just motion, like counting backwards from a place you don't want to remember. I was passing a small grocery store when I saw him. He was pushing a shopping cart with one hand, the other resting on the head of a little girl who walked beside him. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. She had a red jacket with a missing button, long dark hair tied in a sloppy ponytail, and bright blue sneakers that lit up when she skipped. They were standing by a stack of pumpkins arranged under an awning. He was reading the tag on one of them while she tapped each with her knuckles like she was searching for a drumbeat. I knew him instantly. The way his shoulders moved, the slope of his neck, the way he turned his head slightly before speaking. Time had hardened his features, given him the fullness of age, but beneath it all, I saw the child I once carried. The boy with eyes too wide and hands that never stopped moving. And yet, he didn't see me. I was just another figure across the street, a man in an old jacket, too thin for the weather, carrying a paper bag of things that didn't matter. I froze where I stood. My heart didn't pound. It didn't leap. It just settled low in my chest, heavy and still, like a stone dropped into cold water. He crouched down to the girl's level. I couldn't hear his voice, but I saw his mouth move. She nodded, then wrapped her arms around his neck with the kind of fierce confidence only a child could give. He smiled. Not the polite smile you give a stranger, but a real one. The kind that grows slow and stays. I didn't move. Part of me wanted to call out, to cross the street, to speak his name, not as it was, but how I'd whispered it into silence for decades. I wanted to reach into that moment and plant myself there, like I'd belonged all along. But I didn't. Because I hadn't. Because the years had passed without me, and he had built a life where my absence was not a hole, but a fact. Solid. Quiet. Permanent. He stood up again, pulled a small notebook from his back pocket, and jotted something down. Probably a shopping list. The girl danced beside him, swinging her arms. She pointed at something inside the store, and together they walked through the sliding glass doors, disappearing into fluorescent light and aisles of bread and cereal. I stayed where I was. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the wrapper at my feet. It skated down the curb and vanished under a parked car. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower started up, coughing into life before settling into its rhythm. The city moved around me, unaware. I crossed the street slowly, not to follow him, but to stand where he had just been. I looked at the pumpkins. They were small and overpriced, each one with a sticker that read, "Locally grown." I touched the top of one, smooth, cool, a bit soft near the stem. I thought of all the autumns I had missed, the carving, the candles, the laughter. All of it reduced now to a display outside a grocery store. I didn't go inside. I turned and walked the other way, back toward the edge of town where the motel sat behind a billboard that advertised cigarettes and freedom. Back in the room, I placed the paper bag on the table. Inside were 2 bananas, a can of soup, and a pack of instant coffee. I unpacked them methodically, like a ritual, labels facing out, edges aligned. Then I sat. The photograph lay in my notebook, folded just the way I'd left it. I opened it again, more carefully this time. I studied his face, not the man I had seen today, but the boy, frozen in time. He had grown up without me, that much was clear, but something in the set of his shoulders, the calm in his movement, that was his mother. She had given him stability, something I never could have provided, and he had passed it on to his daughter. I saw it in the way she held his hand. I thought about writing again, not another letter, just a note, a message no one would see. I opened to a blank page and wrote, "I saw him. He looked well. She looked happy. That is enough." The pen dragged at the end of each stroke. My fingers were tired, my body older, but my mind held that scene like a photograph, not the kind you fold and hide, the kind you frame inside yourself, a secret, a gift. The watch ticked on the nightstand. The second hand stuttered, but it kept moving. And so did I. Slowly, quietly. A man carrying the image of a life that had gone on without him, and still somehow finding peace in its distance. I leaned back in the chair, closed the notebook, and placed it under the lamp. Outside, the day dimmed, but inside, for a moment, I had light. I began going to the park most evenings after work, usually around the time the shadows started to stretch across the sidewalks and the air grew soft with dusk. It was an old place, not neglected, but tired. The kind of park that had seen better decades, with benches that leaned slightly forward and a fountain that no longer ran, but still held the shape of something beautiful in its stone basin. The grass was patchy, worn thin by time and feet and seasons. Near the center stood a faded merry-go-round with chipped paint and bolts rusted orange. Children still played on it from time to time, pushing it with squeals that cut through the fading light. But most of the day, it sat still, spinning slowly in the breeze like a forgotten wheel. There were pigeons, always pigeons. They gathered near the gazebo where the ground was flat and cracked, and someone, maybe a caretaker, maybe no one, tossed birdseed every morning. I watched them from the same bench each day, near the north entrance under an oak tree that had lost most of its leaves. The bench was warped in the middle, with initials carved into the wood. Some fresh, some so old, they looked like veins beneath the surface. It became a habit. I'd leave the warehouse, my back sore and my knees stiff, and walk the long way through the neighborhood. I passed the same houses, porches filled with pumpkins in October, strings of blinking lights in December, lawn chairs in the spring. The rhythm of life continued there, steady and familiar. I stayed outside of it, a shadow passing on the sidewalk, a stranger with no dog and no phone in his hand. The park was the only place where I didn't feel out of place. There, silence wasn't strange. It was natural. The wind moved through the branches, and the sound of it calmed me. Children came and went. Couples walked slowly, sometimes stopping to look at their reflections in the dry fountain. Old men like me sat on the benches without talking, just nodding if their eyes happened to meet mine. I liked the smell of the park, The earthy damp of the soil, the faint trace of gasoline from the groundskeeper's mower, the musty sweetness of decaying leaves. It reminded me of afternoons long before bars and locks and time stacked like bricks. Afternoons where I might have taken my son there had things gone differently. I sometimes imagined it, not as a fantasy, but as a quiet possibility that never grew. Just a simple image, me holding his hand, guiding him down the path, showing him how to feed the ducks that no longer came. Maybe sitting on the bench beside me, swinging his legs, asking 1,000 questions I wouldn't know how to answer. It wasn't grief. It wasn't longing. It was more like the echo of something that had never been allowed to form. I never brought food. I didn't need it. I brought the same things every time. My watch, which I wound before sitting down. My notebook, though I rarely wrote in it anymore. And a small pocket knife with a wooden handle. Not for use, just for the feel of it in my palm. I liked the weight, the quiet promise of it. I often sat for an hour, sometimes more, just watching. People moved through the park with purpose. I didn't. I simply stayed still. Let the world orbit around me for once. There was a woman who walked her dog every evening, a terrier with stiff legs and a jacket in winter. She passed by my bench without fail, always at the same pace, always with a small wave. I never asked her name. I never spoke. But the rhythm of her walk was something I noticed, something I relied on. The sky changed slowly in that park. The clouds caught the colors of the setting sun and stretched them across the horizon like fabric. I used to mark the shift in light on my watch, noting how it came later each day in summer and earlier in winter. It became a kind of calendar, one that made sense to me. Sometimes I would bring the photograph with me, the same one, folded in quarters. I wouldn't look at it, just keep it in my pocket like a stone, like a reminder. Some evenings I pressed it between the pages of my notebook without opening either. Just feeling the shape of them in my bag was enough. I never saw my son in that park, but I saw boys his age, pushing bikes, eating ice cream, falling and standing again. I didn't study them. I didn't invent stories. I just watched the rhythm of their days, the way they called to their fathers without hesitation, the way they took presents for granted. It was a good thing, a beautiful thing. I didn't envy it. I honored it in my own way, from a distance. One evening, a boy left his toy near the edge of the sandbox, a small red truck, scratched and missing one wheel. He ran off when his mother called, and it sat there for hours, forgotten. I picked it up before I left, not to keep, just to move it to the bench so it wouldn't be taken or thrown away. I set it gently on the seat and walked back through the gate, the truck's color still vivid in my mind. The motel was always the same when I returned, quiet, dim, the hum of other televisions behind thin walls, the click of the vending machine in the hallway. I'd boil water for instant coffee, sit on the edge of the bed, and take off my boots slowly. My ankles cracked each time, the sound sharp in the stillness. I'd open my notebook, not to write, but to see if the photograph was still there. And it always was. The ink of the old letter still faint on the reverse side. The child still smiling, mouth open, frozen in a time I could never reach. The park didn't heal anything, but it held me. And in a life where so much had been taken, that was enough. I didn't plan to say it out loud, not to anyone, not even to myself. But one morning, long before the sun lifted above the roofs, and long before the city decided it was time to begin again, I sat in that motel room with the faded curtains drawn halfway and the cheap coffee cooling beside my notebook, and I whispered the truth, not for forgiveness, not for closure, just because the silence had grown too loud to carry anymore. I had lived long enough with the version of myself I wanted to believe in, the man who had been caught in the wrong place, the man who had made a mistake but hadn't pulled the trigger, the man who still had something worth salvaging. That version of me wore clean lines and straight answers. But in the half-light of that room, with my spine curved and my palms lined like cracked porcelain, I let that man go. The real man, the one who sat barefoot on a mattress that dipped in the center and stared at a letter he never sent, was smaller, less certain, but more honest. I admitted it. I hadn't just disappeared from my son's life because of bars and steel and years I couldn't count. I had disappeared the moment I convinced myself that distance would protect him, that my silence was a kind of love, that not being present could somehow be better than being broken and near. I told myself that for decades, but it wasn't true. It was fear. It was cowardice wrapped in logic, and it had calcified over the years into something I wore like armor. I had taken something from him. Not money, not opportunity, but time. Years of being seen, being known, being remembered. I had let his life unfold without me, and now I sat with the weight of that absence like a stone in my chest. Heavy, cold, permanent. I reached into the drawer beside the bed and pulled out the notebook. The envelope was still there, unsent, the edges softened by my fingers over weeks of indecision. I held it like something sacred, even though I no longer believed in miracles. The pages inside carried my voice, but they didn't carry him. They couldn't. No letter could build a bridge wide enough for the space I had left. Still, I opened it, not to send, but to read. Each sentence sounded different now, not gentler, not harsher, just clearer, like seeing your own reflection not in the mirror, but in someone else's eyes. I ran my finger along the last line. I hope you find everything I never gave you. I whispered it once, then closed the envelope and returned it to its resting place. Outside, the street was beginning to wake. I heard the hollow rumble of the garbage truck, the quiet murmur of tires over wet pavement. A door slammed 2 floors down. A television flickered in the room next to mine. Life moved forward, relentless, indifferent. I stood up and made the bed with stiff hands, smoothed the sheets, folded the blanket back once. Habit, precision, control. The same motions I had repeated for decades in a cell that had once been my whole world. There was comfort in that, comfort in knowing something still listened to my hands, even when my voice failed. I shaved that morning, not for anyone, just for the mirror. I let the warm water run longer than usual, fogging the cheap glass. The sound reminded me of early mornings in the prison washroom, the way the pipes hissed like tired lungs. I ran the razor slowly, carefully, watching the steam curl around my reflection like smoke. Then I got dressed. I chose my cleanest shirt, pressed as well as I could manage, wore the old watch, ticking stubbornly on my wrist, even though the face had a new crack through the glass, diagonal like a scar. I didn't polish my shoes, but I wiped them down with the corner of the towel. It felt ceremonial, not for an event, just for the act of showing up. I took the notebook with me. It felt strange walking with it tucked under my arm. I had carried books before, documents, but this was something else. It wasn't weight, it was memory given shape. I went to the post office, not to send the letter, but to ask a question. I asked about holding documents for future delivery. The woman behind the counter didn't ask for details, just explained the process. I nodded, took the form, said thank you, left without filling anything out. Then I walked to the library, found a copier, a quiet machine in a room with too much light and not enough warmth. I copied the letter. One clean sheet, black ink, a carbon echo of my voice. I folded the copy and slipped it into a new envelope. On the outside, I wrote a name that wasn't mine, a name he could recognize. I didn't write an address. I returned to the church after that, the same one with the warped pews and the fading stained glass that caught the morning light in dull blue and amber. The air inside smelled of wax and old fabric. The stillness was full, I sat in the same place as before, second row from the back, my hands resting on the notebook in my lap, my breath slow and deep, and I confessed again, not with words, not with prayer, just with presence. I stayed for a long time, long enough for the light to shift, for the silence to become a kind of music, for the ache in my back to remind me I was still alive. When I returned to the motel, I took the original letter, the photograph, and the copied page, and placed them together in a manila envelope. I wrote a note on the front, for him, if he ever asks. Then I called a lawyer, not to make a will, but to make a record. Someone needed to hold it, not for proof, not for guilt, but so that one day, if my son ever wondered, he could know, not everything, but enough. Enough to see that silence wasn't always indifference, that absence wasn't always abandonment, that some men love best through memory, through ritual, through words written too late. That night I lit a candle, no ceremony, no speech, just fire, and I let it burn down to nothing, and in that quiet, I finally told the truth. I was the man who left. I was the man who returned too late, and I was still trying to be more than that.